ahead, EJ.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for taking the time for joining us for PQMD's June Pillar Talk, Better Evidence and Data to Transform the Way We Respond to Forced Displacement, a conversation with Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, a part of a larger series of webinars which the PQMD Community of Practice offers to address major trends, leading thinking, best practices, and provocative issues in global health. I'm Elizabeth Ashbourne, PQMD's Executive Director, and I want to welcome you on behalf of our entire team. For those of you who are not familiar with PQMD, we are a global alliance of international NGOs and leading healthcare companies committed to advancing the role of product donations worldwide. Founded in 1999, our work is guided by 5 pillars: humanitarian assistance, health system strengthening, disaster response preparedness, guidelines, and knowledge management. Today, the work of our members is central to the global response to universal healthcare by promoting sustainable access to quality healthcare in underserved communities and displaced populations in crisis. So very quickly, I just want to give you some housekeeping rules. Please type your name in the chat and also let us know your organization as well. And while we request all participants to remain muted, we do invite you to use the chat box for questions and comments, and it will be monitored by Victoria throughout the session. And this session is being recorded and will be posted on PQMD's Community of Practice this week, so you can share it with your colleagues and coworkers when it's done. And I will share the link of PQMD's online Community of Practice in the chat box, so please be sure to join the timely and informative discussions with our members there as well, if you're not already a member of our Community of Practice. So now I have the pleasure of introducing and turning it over to a dear colleague, Bette Scott. Bette is part of USA for UNHCR senior leadership team, serving as the current and first Chief of Program and Strategic Initiatives. Prior to joining USA for UNHCR, Bette worked at UNICEF to help develop private sector partnerships, established a successful consulting practice, and led BD's corporate global social investment program. But I, like most of us here at PQMD, are honored and grateful to call Bette family, as she is one of the founding members of PQMD. So during PQMD's Refugee and IDP Month, and without further ado, we are pleased to bring you this special conversation with Joint Data Center of Forced Displacement, led by our own Bette Scott. Thanks, Bette, and over to you.
Thank you, EJ, PQMD, the program committee led by Pat Baccaros, all of you for dedicating this pillar talk to an issue related to displaced populations as we mark World Refugee Day in June. With the Russian invasion of Ukraine earlier this year, more than now 100 million people are displaced, a dramatic milestone few would have expected a decade ago. That's 1% of the world's population. And as it's often said, and we all know too well, there is a face, a life, dreams behind each of those numbers. With Ukraine, excuse me, refugee issues have been front and center in the news. Yet what the public may not know is that the number of people forced to flee their homes has increased every year, year upon year, over the last decade. And numbers now stand at the highest level since records began. Also, research shows that the probability a person will remain a refugee for at least 5 years, which is considered when protracted displacement starts, is over 60% and varies up to 96%, depending on which situation, which country we're looking at. But rather than me share more statistics, let me just emphasize, we all know numbers are important. They undergird evidence base for national policy development and humanitarian operation discussions. And that's why I'm especially pleased that Maja could join us here today to have a conversation on just how the work of the JDC, that's what you'll hear me refer to it as, right? Maja, it's a mouthful otherwise, but how the joint data center for forced displacement helps to bring the forcibly displaced out of the statistical shadows. Now, you all probably saw in your invitation that Maja is deputy head of the JDC and most previously served as deputy representative for UNHCR in Malaysia. But it's worth saying again, prior to this, she was a senior protection officer in Myanmar, a senior education officer at UNHCR headquarters. She had earlier experiences with UNHCR in Serbia and Montenegro, Thailand, Iran, Bosnia. The list could go on. Needless to say, super experienced. So happy you made the time, Maja. She is fitting this in literally as this program ends. She is getting on a plane again. So Maja, shall we just begin with your first question and start the conversation?
Thank you for the introduction, Bette. I'm really pleased to be here and to be able to speak to you all.
Great. So tell us right at the start, the genesis of the JDC. It was launched in 2019, right? And why is it important? And how has the partnership, because it's unique that it's UNHCR and the World Bank together, are there complementary strengths that have been brought to bear on the issues?
Absolutely. Thanks, Bette, for this question. So this comes out of a sort of a policy context, which has been driven by UNHCR for quite some time now. Essentially, the Global Compact for Refugees has been calling on greater engagement with development actors and with the private sector in refugee situations. But of course, it's not just refugees. There's also internally displaced and there's stateless people. And there's been a campaign to also end stateless initiated by the UNHCR, which also has a policy stream behind it. And in newer times, we're now seeing a consolidated effort to operationalize and end internal displacement through the Secretary General's, the UN Secretary General's action agenda on internal displacement. So these are just mentioning a few big pieces of policies in the space of forced displacement and statelessness at different times. But if I go back to the Global Compact for Refugees, this is where there was considerable conversations between the World Bank and UNHCR to forge a closer relationship, and particularly under the complementary windows of financing that came through World Bank that were dedicated for refugees and host communities. And so while different strands of conversations were going and collaboration grew, there was this idea that actually what we really need in order to mobilize around this big question and challenge globally is socioeconomic data. We know a lot about people from the legal perspective, and we register refugees, but we don't know how they're faring in socioeconomic terms. So what happened in essentially in October 2019 was that the Global Data Center was established. It's a physical team of 15 people sitting in Copenhagen, half World Bankers, half UNHCR people, and they bring together statistical expertise. They're senior economists, they're senior data analysts, and in that sense, they really bring this sort of top-notch know-how and expertise to work with on data. And the comparative advantages of bringing World Bank and UNHCR together in something as concrete as, and non-transactional, I should say, as this, is that you bring the analytical capacity of the World Bank and its ability to link displacement-related data to other socioeconomic data. That's really what the World Bank strength is. And it's hardcore development, right? And from the UNHCR spectrum, you have a humanitarian agency with an incredibly strong protection mandate that has detailed information on refugees themselves, on IDPs, on stateless people, on refugees particularly, usually gathered through the rigor of the registration exercises. And then you have an agency that brings the legal protection framework of the host countries. They're in the field. They work with the governments and with the NGOs and with the international organizations and understand the policy environment in detail.
Thanks. Well, and as you know, thanks for telling us about the staff and their background, but we're not all data scientists or engineers on this call, but we understand data's importance in informing programming and its power in policy discussions. So Can you share a few examples of how data made a difference in the lives of refugees, IDPs, or those who are stateless?
So yeah, so let me just start by saying that, we're 2.5 years old, and data takes time. And so does evidence. It's not something that and this is also, fun for a person like me from the UNHCR working in the team, because in UNHCR everything is now. Whereas in in the World Bank it's rigor, and it's this needs time, this needs proper tools, this needs proper efforts. So just sort of a caveat that obviously not all of our activities, and there are at least 36 country level activities and data in 30 countries that are underway. But I can come up with a couple of examples, and let me start by highlighting the high frequency phone surveys that we've been doing. We've been doing this this is essentially an activity that has been led by the World Bank, and where we got onto it in the process and basically said, can we sort of leverage some of the exercises that you've got underway in order to collect data that includes forcibly displaced and how they're faring during COVID-19. And so this was done in, I think we now have 10 or I think 12, around 12 countries where data on forcibly displaced is being included. And what this data basically does is it allows, it comes in high frequency and comes in different waves, and it gives you information about how the forcibly displaced are faring in education, in access to health, in COVID prevention practices, how do they respond to the offer of vaccines, and different other socioeconomic dimensions. And then over time, you start painting a picture that the operational colleagues can then start informing their responses in the particular countries. So they get actually concrete evidence of that there are particular communities in particular places that are particularly vulnerable to X, Y, and Z, and can then go in and program, because a lot of response has been going out quite quickly in terms of COVID-19. Another example is for example, what we've been doing in Chad. This is another activity that has been led by the World Bank that we've supported financially and with expertise. And here we have this fantastic situation where the National Statistical Office actually included forcibly displaced back even before we existed in 2018. But we helped generate some analytics, and we came on top with a high frequency phone survey during COVID that complemented that data. And so right now the data, all of this data has been collected, and it's been published in a big report called Chad, the Road Forward, as well as briefs on the high frequency phone survey. So this data combined now informs the social protection programming of the World Bank for the Sudanese and Central African refugees in Chad. And for example, next week, in 10 days time, the High Commissioner for UNHCR will be going to Chad, and he will be having meetings with government, with World Bank, with other partners in Chad, and he will have this data and analysis at his fingertips, and will be able to further advocate some of the recommendations that came out to actually integrate development and humanitarian projects, which until recently have been working in parallel, right?
Right.
And maybe that's a good point to bring to the fore. What data does, we're collecting data in some of the big displacement contexts, and most of the displacement, I think it's over 86% of the displaced people, IDPs and refugees, are located in developing countries. And so there's a lot of sense in not having parallel systems, but really getting that data and understanding how to plan differently and more effectively, and in a way that affects those people's lives. Maybe I can add one more example, and just because it's fresh in my head, this is not something that the Joint Data Center has supported, but we have been using it because it links to a lot of the work that we do on statelessness. In 2 days' time, I'll be on a panel at the UNHCR Standing Committee on discussing data and statelessness. And in Kenya, back in 2019, there was both a registration exercise and data collected, socioeconomic data collected in a collaboration between the government of Kenya, World Bank and UNHCR. To cut a long story short, what this helped do was to actually give citizenship to a group of stateless in Kenya called the Shona. The registration data helped identify the Shona, and they were granted citizenship progressively over the last couple of years. And the socioeconomic data, which showed that they were the ones left furthest behind in terms of socioeconomic situation, they're now progressively being included into development programming in the areas where they live. Maybe I'll stop here.
Yeah, no, and thank you for that, because so often in our dialogue, we talk about the intersection between humanitarian aid and development and how that needs to be strengthened. But here we're hearing the JDC exemplifies that. Actually, it's concretely demonstrating where that can happen due to the unique partnership and the focus of your work. So you may only be 2.5 years old, but making great strides. You're certainly walking and almost running already, I would say. And 4 priorities underpin, right, the JDC strategy. And one is about strengthening systems and standards. And PQMD members are that kind of topic is very close to their heart. In fact, they will have a month that is dedicated to the standards they are advancing and promoting for their community of practice around medical product donations and more in their case. But help us understand the standards you're promoting and why it's essential to work closely with national statistic offices. You've mentioned them earlier.
Yeah. So this is our first strategic priority, as you rightly mentioned, Betty, and that one is, we like to say, that's the plumbing, the infrastructure of socioeconomic data and evidence. So you need to have systems and standards to be able to collect the high quality data and data that is comparable with other data, and that you can draw some strong evidence from. And one of the activities that we are very invested in is an expert group on refugees, IDP, and stateless statistics, another large name. This is an expert group that has been established by the highest global statistical authority, the United Nations Statistical Commission. And it started with refugees and IDPs, and just recently they have endorsed the expansion of the expert group to also look at stateless statistics. And essentially what they do is they assemble a body of members who come from national statistical offices in different countries, from regional statistical and entities, international organizations, both on the development and the humanitarian side, and other stakeholders, including from the non-governmental sector. And together they work in these various groups to, one, develop the standards so that we can all have a harmonized approach to how we identify IDPs, refugees, and stateless people in statistics, and how we measure the socioeconomic dimensions of their lives. And in how do we, for example, in internal displacement is particularly important to understand, when does an internal displaced person end being displaced? When is there a solution in sight for them? And particularly for the IDPs, because they're not governed by a legal framework like the refugees and the stateless are, where it's quite defined already in legal terms.
You know, Maja, hold on. May I just pause you there, because I see in the chat box someone has asked, and since they're mentioned, the 3 types of displacement were mentioned so much in your answer, the person is asking, but what is this statelessness? What is refugee versus IDP? Could you maybe just for a moment, because I see this question pop up.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me start with refugees. Refugees are governed by an international convention relating to the status of refugees that was agreed upon in 1951. So it came straight out of the Second World War. The definition essentially is that a person flees persecution for 5 grounds. And these are race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or belonging to a particular social group. And the person will have to have fled his or her country. So there is an implication of crossing a border. As the history progressed, and we were faced with increasing conflicts after Second World War, confined to regions and certain countries, we also saw that definition expanding to generalized violence and war. But still, the definition of a refugee is all of those reasons for either persecution or fleeing danger, but crossing an international border. Whereas internal displacement, as the word alludes itself, is within the confines of the borders of a country. And it can be similar reasons, but most often it is a question of generalized violence and war internally, but people just don't cross a border. They seek shelter or safety in other parts of the country. Stateless, on the other hand, are actually not linked to forced displacement. Statelessness is a situation where you do not have citizenship or a nationality of any country, and you do not have the opportunity to avail yourself to that, which means that you're essentially invisible in society. You don't have a birth certificate very often, you certainly don't have citizenship, and you don't have any documents that prove your identity. And this was a situation that has happened in different contexts. In more recent times, it was, for example, with the split up of both Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, there were people who were all of a sudden lost their citizenship, but didn't necessarily have a claim to the citizenship of the new countries that emerged.
Thanks. Thank you for taking a moment to do that. So it leads right into beautifully hearing those descriptions of people on the move internal to their country borders, finding safety and usually leaving everything behind as well, or maybe leaving everything behind as well. But what are some challenges in collecting data related to these populations?
Well, they can be different, right? I think we saw one which was very concrete during COVID, which, because of the restrictions and the circumstances of the pandemic, it became very difficult to go out and do your regular face-to-face survey, because that's what you do when you do surveys. Yeah. You go and knock on people's doors and you have a lot of questions to them and you spend time with them face-to-face. So we had to find ways of circumventing that, and one of those ways was as I mentioned earlier, was to do something innovative and to use use phones for surveys, because most people in this day and age have some sort of a telephone, and if they don't have a mobile phone themselves, there is a mobile phone in the community, and there are ways of getting in touch with people. Another example I can cite from a recent trip that I took to the Congos. So I was in the Democratic Republic of Congo and the Republic of Congo for roughly 10 days in May. And in the Democratic Republic of Congo, I was in their eastern part, which is very volatile and has frequent smaller, bigger conflicts which cause displacement, which means that the population is fluid. So if you're trying to understand the socioeconomic conditions of people living, both hosts and displaced, living in this area, you have very difficult time making pinpoints to create a sample of, you know, the number of households that you want to visit and speak with, and to understand who is host and who's displaced. So obviously the standards and the questions help with that, but even before you get to that, you need to be able to understand the area and the movements in that space. So here, for example, we use geospatial tools, so aerial, satellite images, combined with protection monitoring data that UNHCR and other NGOs also conduct, together with some maps that OCHA has in trying to pull on all the resources from the humanitarian development partners in the space, combining it together to a methodology that then gives you access to that population. But then you also need to think that data collection can't be long-term. It needs to be frequent. It needs to be quick. It's a security sensitive area. You can't spend 4 hours interviewing people. You need to reduce. What do you prioritize? How do you do it?
Yeah, thank you for those challenges. It makes me think about your, like the second, a second priority you have of your 4, though, which is to produce data and analysis. So let me take a situation that's outside of Ukraine, which is often referenced, but PQMD members, for instance, from both the NGO community and corporate communities responded to the Venezuelan crisis. Help us understand how the JDC generates data to fill knowledge gaps on things like living conditions. You mentioned some on the impact of COVID, service provision, and more.
Right. So indeed, and Latin America is a place, and the Venezuelan situation is a place where we've been active, both in terms of the COVID surveys, but also more generally supporting initiatives around implementing the standards that have been agreed in the expert group, and also collaborating with the national statistical offices, with poverty surveys and surveys that would sort of bring more information about the socioeconomic conditions of the Venezuelans and their hosts. And in some places it has been really successful in terms of supporting already positive policies that were being put in place, for example, in Colombia, where there's been policy decisions that have been quite inclusive of Venezuelans. So what we try and do with the data collection, whether it's in Latin America or the rest of the world, and as I mentioned earlier, we've got 36 data collection and analytical activities going across the different regions of the world where displacement takes place or is a reality. What we try and do is get the forcibly displaced out of the statistical shadow, so that they can be used so that the data can be used for positive policies, opportunities that are transformative in those countries in terms of protecting and securing the well-being of the forcibly displaced and hosts alike. So we never forget hosts. It's always with hosts. And as well as to make sure that some of the development financing and the development humanitarian programming together with the governments takes them into account. And they can only do so if they have that hard data. So that's a big strategic priority and a very active one in terms of the very many activities that we have across the world.
Yeah, wow. Okay, I'm tired already, and I've got 2 more priority actions that you have, and another is to enhance safe and responsible data access. What does that mean? What's the biggest achievement in that space?
Oh, that is very exciting. So, what we try and do is to dramatically increase the quality, quantity, and accessibility to data. So the responsible data access priority is in recognition of the fact that many organizations, including UNHCR, were harboring data that they had collected through different surveys and assessments, but that were not being shared. And they were not being shared because this is data that is collected on a very sensitive population. You heard me explain the refugee definition, persecution, war and violence, and so very delicate. And it requires that you have certain processes of anonymization of the raw data, curating it so that it's actually useful, and understanding where the quality of the data is. So all of this was a process that is well known in the World Bank, but that in UNHCR we didn't know how to do, and we didn't even have a library to store the data in.
Mhm.
So going from zero, and with the knowledge transfer, again, another partnership advantage of the World Bank and UNHCR in this space, we were able to build up a microdata library from scratch in UNHCR that today hosts more than 430 data sets that have been cleaned, curated, anonymized. And with that came protocols and tools of how to handle data, how to protect data, and how to curate data. And this is an activity that we've been extremely proud of, and that we're also using in order to reach out to other stakeholders. Because if UNHCR, with such a sensitive protection mandate, can do it and can open up for their data to become a public good, then certainly there are others who could follow suit, right? And they don't need to have a microdata library to do so. It's both expensive and complicated, but they can have the tools and protocols to be able to put out the data, maybe on UNHCR's microdata library or another one. So that's our sort of external facing activity under this strategic priority. But the big milestone has certainly been UNHCR.
Yeah, and that knowledge transfer, and to be able to create a library from zero that now has how many data sets did you say? 400?
More than four. I think the latest count was 430, but I think they've already surpassing that.
Good to know that's out there. So that building evidence as the fourth and final priority, you can get to the data library. Something I get and I've signed up to receive is your quarterly digest. It's particularly good for lay people like me. You don't have to be a data engineer to glean very important insights from it that inform my work. For instance, I really appreciated reading I think it was titled Refugee Emergencies and Attitudes Toward Refugees. That was very timely in the context of the Ukraine situation. So can you tell us a bit more about the JDC knowledge agenda itself?
With pleasure, Bette, and I'm so pleased that you sort of commented on that digest here at the end, saying how timely that was. That was exactly our purpose.
Good.
So the knowledge agenda is really, again, it's another recognition. You know, when we set out to do our strategy, we did a really thorough gaps analysis, understanding where are the points that are weak in terms of the socioeconomic space in forced displacement. And one of them was also that the research that we see on forced displacement is predominantly legal or anthropological. We've seen very little socioeconomic research in this space, and that obviously has a link to the fact that there hasn't been very much data to research on the basis of. So what we try and do is to stimulate discussion, research. We try and support a type of a community of practice whereby we get the academia to come in and to do more socioeconomic research on forced displacement, and that sort of links up to the practitioners and the policymakers in the countries where we have displacement, and where we urgently need to understand what is the evidence of experiences in other crises, and how can we use those good lessons into those other spaces. So we have a monthly newsletter which has a literature review attached to it, and here we curate the latest research on different topics and provide very digestible summaries of it, so that laypersons exactly can go in and have a quick read and understand where this takes us, and if they want to dive deeper, I wanted to say, they can. We also have a quarterly digest, and the latest one that you just cited was on attitudes towards refugees, and this was a recognition of the fact that, you know, we have had big crises of refugees in different contexts, and they're not always welcome in the countries that receive them. In Europe, we saw quite a huge welcome to refugees coming out of Ukraine. And it was interesting to then look at different other situations to understand what is it that makes the welcome last? What is it that helps the host community get to terms with hosting refugees and helping, and how can we help that understanding along? We've also done quarterly digest on, for example, the gender dimension in forced displacement, or on children on the move, and other such examples. And let me finally highlight the research conference, because this is something that we're also particularly proud of. In January, we hosted the second research conference on forced displacement. It assembled more than 500 people, both practitioners and researchers. We wanted to focus on internal displacement because there's so little research on internal displacement. Sorry, I was saying forced displacement, I meant internal displacement. And it ended up being just a chapter of a 2-day conference that went across different other thematics that also included refugees and related situations. So essentially, what we did was we asked for a submission of research papers to the conference, and out of 150 submissions, we were able to curate and select 34 that were then presented in panel discussions and with fellow researchers and practitioners. But we constantly wanted to make the link with practitioners, that research is not for the sake of research, but that research is really for the sake of building evidence and resolving some of those big questions that we have in forced displacement. And coming out of that research conference, we were able to also understand what is it that we need to focus on. We need to focus more on research in the Sahel, in sub-Saharan Africa. We need more research on internal displacement and certainly on stateless. So that was a big takeaway, and it was a recognition of the Joint Data Center as one of the few, if not the only, conveners of research, socioeconomic research in forced displacement, witnessing that with more data, we are actually seeing an increase in this research, which is super important.
And that's interesting because, you know, how you culled down to those particular research topics, because they came from outside JDC, other stakeholders making suggestions, etc. And prior to this, I shared a list with you of PQMD members that you saw. Some come from the NGO community, INGO community, some come from the corporate community. Are there ways each of these constituencies can engage with the JDC? Can you think of some?
We really engage very broadly with a variety of partners, cutting across private sector, international organizations, NGOs, many different actors, really. And we do so in different groups where we're invested or supporting certain outcomes. But I want to highlight how we also learn from these groups. We have a strategic advisory council, and the strategic advisory council assembles all these entities, including governments. And I think we have more than 70, maybe even close to 100 members of the Strategic Advisory Council. It meets once a year, and every time we meet, we prepare a sort of half-day agenda where we have a particular question or a theme that we seek their advice and input on. And so this is a moment where we take in from NGOs, from private sector, from academia, from different entities, and transform it into our work programs or ideas that we want to see happen, and that we then also take to our management committee, which is our governance structure, where we our activities and strategy and ways forward are endorsed. But I also want to say something even more concrete than that, because, for example, with the responsible data access agenda, the first thing that happened in the context of UNHCR building its sort of path to the microdata library was that we convened a workshop where we learned from the private sector. What does the private sector do with sensitive data? What kind of protocols are they applying?
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of cross-fertilization there that the humanitarian community very often just, you know, forgets is relevant, but it is very relevant. And we learned a lot. It was fantastic. It fed straight into the work that followed. We also learned from foundations and from colleagues in the private sector in terms of how socioeconomic data can support economic inclusion of the forcibly displaced. And here we, for example, had a private, we had a panel, an event that was co-organized with IKEA, and where we also had the Hilton Foundation be a speaker on this and draw on their experiences in their engagements in that space.
Yeah, thank you for that. Just one more question before we open to the broader questions that have, and thank you, Victoria, for monitoring the chat. And of course, we may have even more questions beyond the chat, but one last one from me. As you look to the future, what are you excited about for the JDC? You obviously have a lot of passion for the JDC.
Well, you know, I can answer that from sort of two angles. Let me start with the data angle, and what is really exciting right now and has been for the past couple of years is that there's an incredible momentum and energy in the field of socioeconomic data and forced displacement. People are willing and able, and there's a lot of commitment. And we're seeing that because we're able to have conversations with the institutions that are running some of the major international data surveys. For example, the Demographic and Health Survey of USAID, the labor force survey of the ILO, and to name just a few. Obviously, all the big poverty surveys of the World Bank included. And we have the ear of the national statistical offices. In many ways, socioeconomic data is really an entry point to address the protracted situations and to shed some new light and evidence on how we can address the challenges of forced displacement and statelessness in a different way, and perhaps maybe even in an effective way. So what I am really excited about is the transformation that I think that we have triggered, and that in some years should provide some really visible evidence, and more than what we're seeing already. That's one angle of it. The other angle is the UNHCR protection officer, so the human rights lawyer that has been standing in front of governments for years and years on end and advocated for inclusion of refugees, and particularly, right, in the labor force, for education to kids so that they don't miss years and years of their education. I see, for the first time, I see my dream realized of standing with evidence in my hand as a protection officer and say, this is why you need to do it. This is why it's important. And that's a game changer.
Completely.
Which is just, was unimaginable not so long ago.
Well, Maja, thank you so much. And I've learned even more about the JDC. Here I thought I knew so much already, having taken part in some of the sessions you posted, and keeping up with the newsletter, but I've learned so very much myself. And I hope I can say the same for everyone from PQMD and its expanded circle of stakeholders that have joined us. But I want to turn it over now to EJ and Victoria, who's been helping with the questions in the chat box. Thank you for making yourself available for some further questions. And Victoria, are you ready? May I do that now to you for any you caught in the chat?
Of course, of course. And thank you both for such an inspirational talk. I mean, we don't always have such inspirational these days. And so really appreciate that. I'll start actually with EJ's question, which he has entered into the chat, which is how does the JDC interact with the Paris 21 agenda?
Right. So we are a frequent panelist at the UN World Data Forum, and we have very close ties to Paris 21, discussing particularly on the back of the EGRIS, so the expert group on statistical standards for refugees, IDPs, and stateless people, and promoting a lot of the work together with them. Most recently, we were at the high-level officials meeting that UNHCR had convened, where I was on the panel with our colleague from Paris 21, and we were very much discussing the need for capacity building of national statistical offices, particularly with a view of mainstreaming the inclusion of forcibly displaced in their work. And this, of course, comes with a cost. And it comes with a lot of a need for advocacy with governments, but also with those governments who support capacity building, particularly in the developing countries. So definitely close ties with our colleagues there.
Great, thanks. EJ, did you have any other follow-up questions, or should I move to the next question?
No, please go ahead. But that's really interesting. I mean, it's been a long road. I think Paris 21 though should change its name maybe to Paris 30. Paris 30. Their aspirations were limited. Well, not limited. Their aspirations were probably about 10 or 15 years out. Now they have to go another 10, 15. But I'm glad.
Great. The next question is from Dale Hill, and maybe we can pair this with a question about the budgeting that you have for the JDC. She's actually asking you to sort of step away from your JDC hat and sort of think about the UNHCR. And she's just wondering if you could comment on the UNHCR budgeting. How steady is the budget? How much depends on charity? How much is replenished? Realistically, depending on the different crises that are happening across locations. And maybe you could add in also sort of a comment on the budgeting of the JDC and how you are able to be flexible or respond to various crises that are arising.
Super, thank you. Okay, so I'll venture in this landmine field.
Yeah,
I'm kidding.
I'm glad you're here, Maja.
So UNHCR is traditionally funded by governments, and we have sort of a top 20 list of governments who steadily supports us, and obviously the US government is among the top, so is the Japanese government, and a number of others. That's one part of sort of steady funding. So we don't receive what you call the regular UN funding that comes through the system. We're sort of an ad hoc entity in that context, and we fundraise ourselves. So government funding on one side, but then in the last, Betty, you will help me here, 15 years,
Yeah.
11, something like 15.
A little over 10, yeah. 10, 12,
okay, a little
yeah.
over 10. I was a little bit ambitious there. We've developed the private sector partnerships where we do fundraising with corporate philanthropy through the associations for UNHCR, such as US for UNHCR. And individual giving and various other sort of streams of private funding. So that comes in as well. Then obviously there are campaigns around crises, which is very much used in the private sector. But it's also we also have emergency appeals, which support some of the big crises, like, for example, now on Ukraine. We've seen it with Syria, we've seen it with Afghanistan, we've seen it with very many. Where it comes, it's an ad hoc appeal, and it basically requires an additional in the budget. Do we always get all the money that we ask for? No, as you can imagine. No. So, but very often there is a progression in an emergency, and some of the priorities we can meet, but we are constantly in a crunch because the crises don't select a time, and whatever we thought we needed as a budget at one moment changes radically 6 months down the line.
So just bottom line, Maja, it is donor driven, right? Government donors,
yeah,
private sector donors. That's
exactly donor driven. Yeah.
I mean, not that the work is donor driven, but the funding comes from
funding,
donors.
exactly.
I heard once a statistic that overall less than 2% would come from the general corpus of the UN, if any. Yeah,
exactly. It's minimal. That's why I'm not even
very
citing.
minimal.
Yeah. Donor
But
driven.
then when it comes to the JDC's budgeting,
Right.
how do you do that? Because you have multi-year plans and multi-year vision for the organization.
So this is, we're very interesting that way, right? First of all, you need to understand that we're not independent. We are completely reliant on our parent institutions, even though we function as one team. So Björn is World Bank. He's the head of the Joint Data Center, Björn Gelseder. He comes from the World Bank, and I'm his deputy as the contribution from UNHCR. And we sit physically together, we do everything together, but we are administered by our respective institutions, which also means that, in terms of the funding that we need for our work, we rely on two different streams of funding. One that comes and is fundraised through the Multi-Donor Trust Fund, which is dedicated to the Joint Data Center in the World Bank, and another one which is essentially a cost center, we call it, in UNHCR, part of the Division for Resilience and Solutions, which is also earmarked for JDC. And the first mandate of the JDC was running from late 2019 till the end of 2023, and that period has been costed for $48 million. Right now, we have received some just over close to $30 million, I think, and still fundraising. And that's sort of the total between those two parts of funding where we received. And the main donors to the JDC are the US government, PRM. It's the EU international partnerships. It is the Danish government, which was the first one who came out and filled the Multi-Donor Trust Fund in the World Bank. It is the IKEA Foundation. It is the Hilton Foundation. And we are in conversations with various other partners for further contributions.
Thank you. That was really very helpful and very clear. And I believe that you successfully navigated all landmines, at least from my perspective. So kudos on that. The next question is actually a very specific question to a comment that you had made regarding a part of the Kenyan population that had been deemed stateless. I think you've been talking about that. Could you talk a little bit about how this minority population was deemed stateless and what the circumstances were?
Oh, okay. Now you're going to test my history knowledge. But this is essentially a result of population movement and borders being drawn up in Africa, and particularly in the area of Kenya. I'll be very happy to give you the link to a blog about this, and also the study on the Shona, which is super interesting and can really give you all the details, rather than me testing my memory on the intricacies. But it's a historical consequence, as we have seen actually several places in Africa.
Great. I also am going to take the liberty as the chat reader to ask my own question, which was, you had talked about that you have 36 studies going on, I think, in 30 different countries. And I was just wondering if you could sort of talk a little bit about where the bulk of those are. Are they very spread out, or are they really concentrated in certain areas? Could you talk a little bit about where those studies are, and maybe talk about a few of them?
Yeah, definitely. So we've had quite a few analytics in the Mashrek region, which pulls together Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and have worked in those, and still working or supporting activities that are either led by the World Bank or UNHCR or jointly in those places. both individually and as a region. So a lot of the work in the Middle East has focused on the Syrian displacement. In Latin America, it's been very much the Venezuelans, and we're now sort of finishing up on that part of the work and focusing more on internal displacement in Honduras and in Colombia. In Colombia, we've just endorsed the activity that is going to test the standards on internal displacement, collecting data of internally displaced in Colombia. And that will also help them with the statistics, because in Colombia, they notoriously have challenges with establishing the number of internally displaced. Until recently, it was more than 8 million. We've now seen a reduction to, I think, 6.8. And probably there's a little bit more cleaning up in the data that can be helped by these socioeconomic surveys. In Africa, we've been in quite very many places, not sufficiently in Sahel, but DRC, the Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, Djibouti, Chad. I'm forgetting a few, but Uganda, we're just entering Uganda now with an activity where forcibly displaced will be included in the DHS for the first time ever, which is a huge thing, and particularly in a large forcibly displacement context as Uganda, and hopefully that's going to set a precedent for other international surveys. Southeast Asia, we have a what we call a mini JDC in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where we're running different types of surveys. So we're supporting the World Bank to steer sort of a coordination hub of survey work that includes the forcibly displaced and can feed into the programming that they have there. That's a large situation. And we have something equivalent to that in the DRC. I mentioned we have a couple of activities in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then we also have an activity that in Malaysia, where we're looking at the inclusion of refugees in labor and employment, sort of evidence that can lead to their inclusion in employment, formal employment.
Right.
I think I'm probably losing a few, but Southeast Asia, Middle East, Eastern Horn of Africa, a little bit more south as well, and then Latin America.
I think that was super helpful for a lot of people joining the call and just really understanding how closely their work links with all of the amazing data that you are collecting. So thanks for doing a little tour of the world with us there.
Yeah. Happy to. And just to highlight, I just put a link in. I realized that it's not Teams where, it makes the beautiful picture. So this is a link that's going to take you to our annual report, which we came out with just in the beginning of June. Which will give you some report information about our achievements in 2021, but also some analytics in terms of what is the thinking behind the work that we do. And then it gives you 10 concrete activity examples across the 4 strategic objectives. And then tells you a little bit more in depth about the work, and it also gives you an idea of the challenges that we face in this work and how we overcome them. We had the pleasure of presenting this to the president of the World Bank group, who came to our offices on 9th of June, and we had an exclusive 60 minutes with him where we just clawed through the substance, telling him why this is making a difference, and asking him to be our champion for the statistical inclusion of forcibly displaced. And it's really hit a soft spot, I hope, because he's tweeting and we're seeing blogs out of the World Bank, and there's a lot of good attention and goodwill.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for such a fascinating conversation. Really, really interesting. I'm going to turn it over to EJ just to close this out, but I can't thank you enough.
Yeah. So I also want to say thank you. What an exciting way to end this discussion, and that I can't think of a session that has made it more clear that what is counted matters. I know that's cliche, but clearly this is the case. And I was particularly interested around how the socioeconomic data that you have on forced displacement is really inspiring change. For those people in the data field, I think they know it well, but it can't be said enough because, you know, people always complain about having to provide data or collect data, but I think it's been really fantastic to hear just how critically important it is for global development, and particularly with these populations. So I just want to say a very big thank you to Bette and Maja. And Maja, wishing you a really healthy and safe travel season. It sounds like you don't sit still very long. And for your time and insightful thoughts. We're all in this together, and PQMD will continue to bring you webinars and host intriguing online discussions through the community of practice. So thank you everybody for joining us, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.